Hello, friends. Presumably, we are now live again. Today, our topic is going to be source generators. And I will not talk much, hopefully. I will just ask questions. And then we'll see how that goes. So let's introduce ourselves again. So my name is Immo Landwerth. I'm a program manager on the .NET platform team. And with me today are...
Kathleen. I'm I'm the PM on the .NET team. Work with the SDK CLI languages, including Visual Basic and C#.
I'm Phillip, also PM on the .NET team. I do languages stuff, I do Visual Studio tooling stuff, and I have a good time.
Yeah.
Well, let me not spill my tea. That would be good. Yeah. Everybody remember that you can ask questions in chat, and hopefully we will answer them. There will be, I think, a demo, right, Kathleen? So lots of opportunities.
Oh yeah, we got a couple of things. We're gonna look at a little bit of code. We're gonna talk about source generators. Source generators are super interesting, and we'll talk about how you might use them, how they're gonna affect you even if you're not writing them yourself, and show you some generators that are simple and one generator that's kind of complicated, and talk about how to think about the problems. So yeah. That's the story. We might talk about other things if you have questions on other things. I know we're coming up on a release, and the next time we do this, hopefully it'll be all about .NET 5. But right now, yeah, I've been talking a lot about .NET 5. I'm going to talk specifically about one feature. Dive deep. Yeah.
These are the best ones, right?
Yeah. Do you want to jump right into that? Or you want to see if anybody has any questions on the state of the world? And we just have people saying hello. So hello to everybody. Yeah. Hello.
There seems to be a lag between audio and video. That is interesting. I don't know what to do about that.
Yeah.
So then what we could try doing then is we could move our mouths without any sound and then start talking. And maybe we can catch up to the lag.
Yeah, no. Definitely
I'd be willing to try that.
Yeah. Okay, well, it seems to not be affecting everybody. So hopefully that'll clear itself up for anyone who's running into a problem with that. So yeah, you want to jump into it, Immo, or you have anything else?
Yeah, no, totally. On? Like that, people will ask questions in chat anyway. So
hey, Phillip, why don't you talk about, this is this blog post you wrote back in April, and it's been updated. There's a better blog post now that folks can look at, which is Luca wrote. And why don't you talk a little bit about, in general, source generators? What do they do?
Yeah.
Why should somebody care?
Source generators, as you mentioned, the sort of the first release came out this April. It was a very just preliminary release, and it sort of addressed kind of laying the groundwork for this compiler feature. So kind of at a high level, most of the times when we do new features in C#, they are language features, like records or better pattern matching or something like that. But source generators are a compiler feature and not a language feature. So, I mean, what we do is we still right now kind of require, I think we shouldn't require this anymore, but we did at one point, we required you to set your lang version to preview because we reserved the right to make breaking changes in source generators as they were being built. But source generators are fundamentally a compiler feature. They're kind of like analyzers, but they allow you to also emit C# source code sort of when the analyzer is finished running. So if you're familiar with analyzers, they basically run during compilation, and they analyze your source code, and they emit diagnostics. So an analyzer will say, oh, well, I know that, like, I don't know, like there's no maybe a good example is there's like no return value emitted, from like a method or something like that. Or maybe there's a bunch of other custom analyzers that are written, like XUnit has a couple of them where it's like, oh, hey, you're doing this thing with the API, and that's not really a good idea. You should actually use this API instead. And we're also releasing a lot of measures in .NET 5 that are along those lines of helping you better use .NET APIs. And they're all about introspecting code. But as I said, all they can do is emit a diagnostic. They can tell you that you did something wrong and where you did something wrong, or something wrong could also just mean, hey, you could improve this area in the code, and maybe that could affect a code fix that could adjust the code and things like that. But they don't emit source code; they emit diagnostics. So source generators come in and they say, well, sometimes you don't want to emit a diagnostic. Sometimes you want to analyze source code and you want to generate source code from the code that you've been analyzing. It's a metaprogramming feature, basically. There are a lot of other metaprogramming features out there that exist in other languages that kind of act in a similar space. Some people have certainly mentioned that in the initial blog post, that macros are a similar sort of feature in other languages where you can write code that generates code basically based off of the structure of the code that's being analyzed. Source generators work in a little bit differently, but fundamentally they are an analyzer that analyzes your source code, and then there's a small set of APIs that you use to generate C# code based off of what you're reading. Now, it's not just source code that acts as an input to a source generator. Now, when I first wrote this blog post, that was actually all that you could do. All you could do is say, "Hey, here's the source code. Please analyze that." But as you can imagine, if you want to generate code based off of code, you may want to pass data to a source generator, or you may want to incorporate a third-party package that does something interesting while it's generating source code. And those are some updates that have shipped along the way, in addition to some tweaks to the API and stuff like that. So now there's sort of two key capabilities in addition to APIs and better Visual Studio tooling, is that you can, as a part of sort of, the host that hosts a source generator in compilation, can say, here's additional data that I'm going to pass down into the source generator. And the source generator can say, I accept data that looks like this. Source generator itself can now depend on a package, and it can use these two things, input from the program and a package that it depends on, to generate much more interesting code. So in this updated blog post that's called New C# Source Generator Samples, there are two of them. I'll talk about the first one briefly, which is being able to give you strongly typed access to a CSV file.
Phil, just to let you know, we're going to look at that in just a minute. I've got it up. So I thought that go ahead and finish, the overview.
Yeah.
And then
I was
just dive deep, we'll actually dive deep with the code up on the screen.
Yeah, and so at a high level, what this one generator does is it accepts input from the host program, because this is the CSV file. I want you to generate C# code that maps to that CSV. So like the rows and the columns, like all the names and stuff, can be accessed in my calling C# code. So basically, it will be passed a CSV file. It will read that CSV file. It will then create classes that map to sort of the structure of that CSV file. And those classes will be emitted as source code that a calling program now has access to. So instead of you having to write your own CSV parser and that kind of stuff, you can just say, oh, give me the strongly typed class that represents this CSV file, and then I'm just going to dot into rows and columns and that kind of stuff and get the data that I need. So this is something that Kathleen is going to dive quite deep into. I believe, Kathleen, you had mentioned that you have some tips and tricks. So not just showing the code, but showing how you can do some really cool stuff when you're working on source generators. So I'm pretty excited to see what you have to show us.
Yeah, so before we go there, there's a question in chat that I think is worthwhile answering before we do that. So somebody's asking, what is the difference with this versus something like Fody? And can you also explain what Fody is?
I think that as we show it, it's going to become somewhat more clear. It's really hitting a different spot. So Fody is, unless I have it confused with something else, is working with the IL and is actually changing IL. And there's a fundamental principle which we have no intention of changing, which is that source generators cannot change code. They can add code, they cannot change code. And it's because of the box we decided to put around it for a sense of safety in terms of this is .NET, and we think there's certain expectations that you can have coming to that. One of which is you can see the code, and I'll show you how you see the code. And the second is that we're not going to make any code that exists go away or be changed. So there's various tricks that you can use, not all of which we'll show today, about how you can make code do what you want, but it doesn't fundamentally change it. And Fody does let you do that. So you can't just insert in the middle of a method, and that's something Fody can do. So
I mean, the other big thing is that Fody is basically running on the IL, right? So that means after the compile happens.
It's working with, right. So one of the common things it can do is if you want to put a logging message at the top of every method, that is something you can do with Fody. But this is not something you're going to do with the C# source generators. It's just not designed for that. So I don't think it takes PostSharp and Fody out of the picture completely. I do think it changes some of what you're doing with it. And I think the big thing is source generators are going to open a new set of things people can do. And for those of you that don't know, about 19 years ago, I started writing a book on source generation in Microsoft .NET. And so it's been quite a journey. And I'm really excited about where we are today and how much this is going to take the experience, generative experience, and just interleave it with your development experience. And it's not going to be like a separate thing. And I think that's super exciting. So let's look at some code. We've gone too long without looking at code. So let me bring up source generators. And there was a link in the blog post you just looked at that would take you to a repo. It is the Roslyn SDK. And I cloned the Roslyn SDK. And then wandering down in there, under samples, I found the source generator samples and opened the solution that was there. That's how I arrived at the code we're looking at today. And the first thing I want to look at is actually the Hello World generator.
Can you zoom in like 4x?
I can. How big do we want it? Tell me when to stop.
Yep, that's good because people watch on their mobile devices, right? And that doesn't quite work.
Yeah, I think that's great. Okay, so this is a source generator, and we'll come back to look at this, but we also want to look at how it's called. So those two things go hand in hand. So the code you would write is this. This is all the code that you write in this, but you have a reference to a package, and that package reference is to this Hello World nupkeg. It's a NuGet package. And then once you have that, just like an analyzer, once you have the analyzer in your project, then it's going to run. And so we're going to generate some code, and I'm going to go there by hitting a normal F12, and I'm going to go to the code. This code does not exist in my project. We could pick something up from this and try to search the project, and you wouldn't find it because this is in a temporary location, but the code is available to you, and you can ask that it be written out if you want to have a record of that. I don't know other than just an occasional check when you would want to do that. Now, this is Hello World, and you could obviously write a library that had the first two lines, line 9 and 10. But lines 11 through 18 are specific to this project. So if you were to put this source generator into one of your projects, it would have a different list of of syntax. These are syntax trees that are being pulled in. So a different list of, I think these are .cs files, but we'll check. A different list of .cs files in your project. So this is kind of the simplest one, and I think it shows us how the generator works if you want to write one. And understanding how it works is fun, even if you don't know if you'll write one. So there are there's actually 3 methods that you might be interested in. One of them is an initialize. So if there's something you need to do to start up, then you can do that, okay? The second thing to do is to execute, and this is where the work happens. Now, I'll talk to you later about a more complex source generator, in which case, predictably, I'm going to suggest you not put a lot of code in here, that this is the way you kick off your process, and your process is someplace else where it's testable. I'll talk a lot about making sure things are testable. So here we've got this hello world, that's great, and then it goes through and it looks at the syntax trees just as a way to mark that it is not the same as having a library. All right, so do we have any questions in chat on this much? Because I'm about to jump into that CSV generator that Philip just talked about.
The one question that was popping up is, can the generated code be embedded in the PDB for later debugging?
Can it be debugged in what for later? Sorry,
can the generated code be embedded in the PDB? So when you debug later, that the source is still available, right?
I can't imagine. I don't have somebody here from the team to guarantee this, but I can't imagine it's not already in the PDB. I don't know how this could possibly work if it wasn't in the PDB. So I have not actually done that, but I assume it is in the PDB.
Yeah, my understanding is, Phillip may know more, but I think it's embedded by default.
Yeah, I can't imagine how it cannot be embedded. So it is source code. Once it's created, so the compiler has a step, like it does with analyzers and other things, and says, oh, let me see if there's something else to do. Oh, I need to run some source generators. Let me run those source generators. And now it's code. There's nothing different between this code and the rest of the code. So it's not in my mind right now, anyway, this could not be in the PDB. So the answer is going to be yes, but understand that I'm not on the team and there's some chance I'm wrong, okay? That can happen.
And then the other question was, is this part of Net 5?
It is part of Net 5. It's part of C#, the C# 9 compiler. And what I don't know, but Phillip might, is can you use this on lower versions of C#? If you're in the C# 9 compiler? It is compiler features, so I don't know what we've done with that. If we believed there was problems, we would have blocked it. We would have blocked it if we thought you could get into trouble doing it. Okay, so
we block it. It's inaccessible with an older compiler. Period.
On older compilers, yes. But if you're in the C# 9 compiler, but you're targeting C# 8, are you going to be able to use it? Because I don't know the answer to that question.
You can use it, but you need to use a new tool set. So you basically need the .NET 5 SDK, and then you're targeting a down-level TFM or a down-level language version. Right.
So if you think of your versions in terms of C#, this is in the C# 9 compiler. Again, it's a compiler feature, not a language feature. And the C# 9 compiler is in Visual Studio 16.8. So the one that's in preview right now is where you see this. I am running the public preview. So everything I do today, you can do. It was a little more stable than the nightly. I've been having trouble with the nightly. So I jumped into the most recent. I don't remember what it is. I'd have to look to see what the version is. Any other questions? Are we people? Yeah, so Mark Flug said that the challenge is in understanding the syntax tree, and that's why I'm going to talk about separating the process. That's where the real work is. Creating strings, that's pretty easy, but figuring out what you have to start with, that can be hard. I'll talk a little bit about it in 2 contexts here in a minute. All right, so let's look at that CSV generator, okay? So first of all, let's look and see here's the CSV, cars.csv. There's just some cars, okay? And second of all, we're going to go to the use CSV generator to see what the code looks like, okay? So we have a cars, a cars class, obviously has a static method. We look at this as C# programmers, and we go, hey, there's a static method called out. And let's look for this. Let's go ahead and do the search for cars across this entire solution and see what we find, okay? So we're going to find the entry that we are looking at. The cars.all, that's the second one. The first one is actually just an entry in the project file. Okay, so this is not very interesting, and it doesn't tell us where the code is. So the code is not in our world. And so searching for it via a search isn't going to find it, but I can get there real easily with an F12. So I hit F12, jump over there, and it doesn't like my line endings. I don't care. And now we can see the class, which is brand, model, year, and CC, whatever that is. And then we can look at, I guess it's the size of the engine. And then we have two entries that are that are going to be there. Where did this come from? How did it get that data? Where did it come from? And that is what is different. There's two things special about this. One is that the CSV doesn't necessarily have this shape. Sure, we could put this shape into a NuGet package if we already knew what cars looked like, but we don't know what cars looks like. We don't even know that it was going to be called cars. Okay, so all of this is generated based on the CSV. And so what's a code? Is that hard? Is that code hard? So let's take a look at that. And, well, I'm not there. Sorry. The one above it. There we go. All right. So this one has a lot of methods in here. Most of these are public and don't need to be. I would suggest that you consider bringing these outside of this actual file into something that you can actually work with and test a little bit more removed. The fact they're public does mean they are testable. But there's you also don't need to necessarily put all this into this file. You just need to run it like normal C# code. This is just normal C# code, doing normal C# code-ish like things. What we want to look at for is the execute method. So we have execute, initialize, and one more that we'll look at in the final generator that's in those samples that we're going to look at. All right, any questions? Immo and Phillip, if you want to stop me when we have something we need to look at in terms of questions. We need to go back.
Two that were coming
we're
up.
not doing anything initialized.
So one was, is there F# and VB support for source generators?
We're discussing VB support because VB is also a Roslyn compiler. So, and that's just, we want to support analyzers. We are supporting VB going forward in terms of the experience. And this, I know it's very confusing that we're not planning on enhancing the VB language. However, we are planning on enhancing the VB experience. And I do understand how confusing that is right now. And I'm hoping once 16.8 hits the street and people see what that actually means, that there's going to be less confusion. But we are discussing that right now. And then F# uses a different compiler. So that if they were to support this, Phillip can comment on this. It'd be a lot of work. So Phillip, do you all have an official opinion position right now on generators for F#? F# needs them less because they do things different.
There's no plan to ever support this on the F# side. There is a eventual desire to do code generation for helping AOT scenarios, but it's not like source generators itself. Like there's no plan at all to do that. It would require rewriting the entire F# compiler, which we're not going to do.
All right, so that was clear. Okay,
And
so
then the other question, sorry, there was one more question on, are they sequenced? What happens if you have more than one generator in a project?
They have to be written in a way that they can run in any order. They cannot depend on each other. And that is also kind of unlikely to change. We do know that for some people, it means they have to think about some things differently. Specifically, if two can go into the same NuGet package, then you can kind of see how they can smush in and use the information from each other that doesn't rely on the order in which they occur. For example, you might have two in some sort of a configuration to say whether they should both run, and then they share data, and whichever one runs first sets that data up. There's some things like that you can do, but in terms of actually saying that we're going to have them ordered, that's highly unlikely to happen. So anything else, Immo? I'm sorry, I want to jump on too quick.
I think this was it.
Okay, so there's I'm looking for where we're opening the actual file because it should show that we're using two external files here, and I'm looking for where we're actually opening them, and I'm not seeing that right now. Let's go to Get Load Options and see if that shows us opening an external file. Point is that there's things called additional files that are generally going to be set in your project file. So here's additional files for people and cars. So we can open these additional ones. There's also some just general settings that's desired by this generator. So it's opening an additional file. And that's the way that you do that. So that means that the cars.csv, the fact that class is named cars, the fact that that's the CSV file that you open, that's defined in your project file. So generate a demo, that's your code. And then the generator can pick that up and has the capacity to use these external files for configuration of the generator or any other purpose like this CSV. So we can do additional files. We can do, we can initialize. Then I'll show you in a minute how we can pick up data more easily than having to go through the entire syntax tree. That is the hard part of this. And for simple analyzers, there is a shortcut you can take that will probably be pretty effective. Any other questions? Or should I move on to the third sample generator? Then I'm going to talk about the way I'm thinking about a really complex generator that I'm writing, or it's relatively complex. Any other questions, Immo, you want us to get to?
One of the questions was, it wasn't a question, it was a statement. It said unit testing will be very difficult, which I believe you might have an answer for.
I am going to talk about unit testing because I did all of my work with the intention of, oh my gosh, especially because I have right now just one contributor. When I show you, I want more contributors. So when I get there, pay attention, see if you want to help. But the contributor I have is hardcore TDD. Relatively early career, never worked without TDD. And so it's like, this has to happen this way. So I will, yeah, I will show you about testing because yes, testing could be a nightmare and it takes some work to have it not be a nightmare. And I'm really pleased with where I'm at with that. So anyway, let's look quickly at auto notify generator for one thing in here. I'm not going to go through this whole generator. I'm in the wrong place. I want to be in the generator itself, which is right here. Oh, before I go there, I talked to you about the fact we can't change existing code. And so sometimes we might have to be a little tricky, and this is a little tricky. So notify property change, if you're a web programmer, you may not know about this, which is things that work on events, which are all the desktop stuff, anything like that, often have, want to be able to say for this class, I want you to raise an event if a value changes. So this allows a field to be updated. That's the basic problem we're trying to solve here. And there's a long-standing way to do this with an interface called iNotifyPropertyChange. You'll notice it's not on this class, but there is an attribute on two fields. And the reason fields are used is because we can't change something to add behavior to it, but we need some special behavior on the property. So for this one, I think this one, oh boy, I don't remember how today to get to a class that you can't just F12 to. And I don't think I can't F12 to this because I'm looking for the other partial. These are partial classes, and I don't actually know how to get there at the moment. So we're not going to look at the output code right now, but I do want to show you something about this generator. And so this generator is looking for, it is, what I want to see is the, I thought this had an on, yeah, okay. This has a syntax receiver, and the syntax receiver is registered someplace. Let's see where that is registered. It is registered right here. So what we're going to say is we'll say that a syntax receiver is a way that you can, as Rosalind is doing its work, as the compiler is working, it's going to check in with the syntax receiver and do the work that syntax receiver is asking it to do. What we want to do is set up the candidate fields ahead of time. So the syntax receiver, which is registered there, is going to run, and it has this on visit syntax node. So at some point, and we don't care when, Rosalind, as it's doing its work, is going to say, I'm going to pay attention to this syntax receiver, and I'm going to call that code and do whatever it tells me to do. And right now what it's saying is that you know what, if you're a field and you have an attribute, we'll look at you later. You're a candidate. We're not going to worry. We're not going to take the time as during normal compilation to do anything that's not super fast right here. But finding out if it's a field and if it has an attribute super fast, so we can pre-create a bunch of candidate fields. Now, the person who talked about how difficult it is to work with a syntax tree. This is a shortcut that will work in many cases. So if you just care about fields, now you don't have to worry about the rest of the syntax tree. All you have to worry about is get a hold of the field you want, and then you will have to, from the field, reach back up to grab the containing class so you can add properties to the containing class. But that's a simple jump inside the syntax tree. What's really hard in the syntax tree is to go through the entire syntax tree trying to find something. And you're like, okay, wait a minute. And then you get into, could it be in a nested class? And you wind up with some really, there's a lot going on in the syntax tree. And so letting Rosalind traverse that tree for you is very desirable. And for many source generators, this is going to be an important trick to simplifying your problem so you're not having to traverse that whole tree. And it will be faster because Rosalind's kind of sticks it into its work at a good spot and makes it happen fast. All right. Okay. So I'm going to jump into the generator I'm working on, which is in progress, unless there's more questions on the samples. Good. All right. So I want to just talk for, I'm sorry, I almost want to apologize whenever I have a PowerPoint, but I'm a PM and PMs do PowerPoints, and mostly I do bad PowerPoints these days. And this PowerPoint, man, it really went south, but I've got enough you're going to be able to see it, but the boxes exploded and stuff. It really got ugly. So PowerPoint and I were not getting along this morning. I just want to tell you what this project does. So there's something called System Command Line that we're working on as a parser, and it's available for global tools right now. Lots of global tools have used it, but you have to get to know it. It's a library that you actually have to learn how to work with. And my goal is that you don't have to know anything about System Command Line to create a global tool. That is what I care about. And to create anything else that needs a parser, a command line parser. So that's the goal that I want to get to. And I want to do that using source generators. I have a previous version, which was predictably Starfruit 1, which is completely based on reflection. And I will probably completely give it up completely because I think that the source generation is that much better of an approach to use. So that's kind of a little bit of the context of it. What I want to focus on today is the way I thought about the complex problem and why, and testing, because testing is a big deal for these. You can just imagine if you get something complicated, how quickly it could just be crazy to try to test it. So rather than just jumping straight into tests, I want to show you the way I thought about the problem in order to make it testable. So that is looking at the pipeline from I have some input, which is going to be C# code right now, and then I'm going to get to actual source generator in the end. That's the pipeline I want to work on. If I try to do that entire pipeline together, then the person who said this is going to really be hard to unit test is absolutely right. How do you do that? Well, you don't. You separate it. You break it down. That's the way we know to get to a testable scenario. So we're going to take the input and we're going to go through something. I call it a maker, but whatever. We go through something and creates an interim structure. And I believe this is very important to do for non-trivial source generators. Anything where you can't just make a syntax receiver and take advantage of that, or it's not super easy to go through and find what you need out of the syntax tree. So if you're using some external file like that CSV file, sure, you can just put it in place and test it and that's all fine. But if you're actually trying to reverse syntax and understand that, and you need to put it into something you can look at and test. So I have an interim structure, and it actually models what I'm going to output, and creating that is the hardest part by far of this exercise. This entire problem will be mostly there. I right now spent most of my time on building out this pipeline of how it's going to be, how we're going to go about building it. So right now that's pretty weak. It just does a command name, but this is the mechanism by which we'll be moving forward. So then there's a string generator that creates string output, and that string output looks like C# code. That's what it actually is. But I want to test that and then eventually that goes to the source Okay, so eventually it winds up in that code that we looked at with the samples. And I probably, because it's the way I tend to work, will have separate files for these other things, but they all get combined into one NuGet package. So the string output, I want to test in 2 ways. One of which is I want to, first we'll look at the whole test pattern. So I need to give it the same thing the source generator is going to get it. So I need to start with something. I think I'm actually starting with a syntax tree instead of the full generation execution context. But what I care about from the generation execution context, which is passed to the execute method of the source generator, what I care about at that point is the syntax tree, okay, and the semantic model. So being able to get the semantic model with the syntax tree and the context, that's what I care about. And then I also may care about candidates. So I'm not actually using a syntax receiver, but if you're using a syntax receiver, then you want to have as feed into your process a set of candidates, which you can just manually create. All right, so the next thing I want to do is see if my interim structure is right. If the interim structure is right, I want to test the string output in 2 ways. The first thing I want to do is I want to test fragments. This is where our unit test ideas really make sense, okay? I'm not going to say, tell me what the file is going to look like. I'm going to say, tell me what the part of that file that creates a command, system command line creates commands, creates options. So a part that creates a command, the part that creates an option, what does these individual small pieces look like? And that's what I want to test to make sure they're right in isolation. And then I have more tests to say, well, if I wrap that in a class, if I wrap that in a namespace, how do those things do those things look correct as well? So for example, I might have a very complicated option and be checking an option that has lots of different things set on it to see whether the small option looks correct. But then if I see whether it's going to come together correctly in a class, it's going to be a super simple option that's fitting in to see whether the overall class looks right. Okay, the second thing I want to do, which requires really fun trick, is that I actually want to run that code. I don't want to wait until it's sitting in a source generator. First of all, I don't want to wait until it's sitting in a source generator to find it doesn't compile. Oh, how sad will that be? And remember, this is not a simple one. So we're going to have either an unbounded list. I have a son who's a physicist, so it's very hard for me to say it's infinite because he would complain. But it's a very large set of variations that could happen. And so many things could fail compilation. And I don't want to find that out after I've got a NuGet package that's installed in a project somewhere else. I want to find that out in a test compilation. So will it compile? And then once it compiles, I actually want to run it. And I want to see if the way it runs the way I need it to run. Okay, so that's the context of this. And I see a lot of things flashing past in the chat. Are any of those questions I should answer, Immo? Or do you want me to just go to code now?
I think code will be good.
Mm-hmm. I know, this is a lot to hold in your head for just a second. I have one more really quick thing to show, which is for us, there's another wrinkle to this story, which is that the input may not just be a C# model. The C# model we would bring in as a syntax tree, which we can create and go from there. The other things may be for us as a JSON file. So if you have ever typed .NET new blah, then after blah, when you add .NET new blah -- framework, okay? So when you say that, framework is picked up as part of a parser, which is currently the old parser from the CLI. And we will be replacing that with this parser, the system command line parser. Not, we're using this over the system command line parser so we can get to that power and amazingness. This is just like how we get there. But we need to put in a JSON file in. That's what we have from the template .json that we start with. And then once we get this in, I have to tell you, I'm very excited. We're going to have tab completion soon-ish on .NET New, and then .NET New template name, and then have tab completion. I'm really excited about that. Okay, so that's a big picture of what we're doing. What I want to do is take a look at the place in this that I want to kind of drill down into is the tests. And the tests that I most want to drill down into are the two around the strings. So can I compile it and can I run it? Now, I can also back up and I can show you what our input is. I can show you a little bit more about the generator, a little bit more about what the interim structure looks like and all of that. But I probably just have about 15 more minutes or less. You guys may be tired of hearing from me. And so I don't want to get too scattered across this. I want to go into a deep understanding, and I think this is the most interesting part. But people have other questions. But does it work? Yes, it works, Jason. Yes, it depends on how you define working. The whole thing is not finished. Like I said, definitely open to contributors. And breaking this up like this, it was one of the things I really was thinking about, is that I don't want anyone to have to understand all of this. If what you care about is understanding how to make strings from a structure, then you can work on that part. If what you care about is how do you test these, you can work on that part. So it was a big part of the way I was thinking as I was putting this together. So this unit test example, I will make this public. It is Kathleen Dollard on GitHub, and then it is Starfruit 2, and it is not yet public. I started private, but I decided this morning when I decided I wanted to share this with you all. I'm so excited about it. I decided that I would make it public as soon as I finished this talk. I would have done it beforehand, but I ran out of time. I had a previous meeting, so yeah. Okay, anything else down in the chat I should? Okay, so this uses something you may not have used before, which is .NET Interactive. So let me open up the project file for a minute. And you will see .NET Interactive as soon as I find it right here. Package reference, .NET Interactive. Okay, so .NET Interactive is work that's come out of the team that also did try.NET. It has been expanding, and it's the way that we do the .NET. .NET Interactive works in Jupyter Notebooks. .NET Interactive works in C#. You may have seen this demoed, because what it lets you do is have a little block that has code, and then you execute it, and then you get the result right there. And that result might be a big, beautiful graph. It might be a Pong game. I mean, it could be anything. But whatever it is that you're doing then is displayed in place, and then you write a little more code. And all of that builds up the idea of a submission. And so you wind up, the idea of a kernel, and an instance of a kernel has a set of code in it. So the set of code that you have, and let me just keep this open, the set of code that's in the kernel right now is what you can run. So if I create a method called blah, and I do a submission to put blah into the kernel, then the next submission I make can go and call that. And I do want questions on this, because I realize it's kind of a new idea to a lot of people how .NET Interactive works under the hood. No questions, cool. Then it was easy, then I explained it great. Because it's a little bit mind-bending at first. Wait. So the C# kernel, we create one. And let me close this one for a second, because this is the one I care about right now. And when I was going over this with somebody, then I have to laugh about this. And I don't know if I should say this or not, but the contributor is actually my son. And there's points in your life as a parent that, like first day of kindergarten, they're very super exciting. And my son becoming a professional programmer, all that awesome, he's all this stuff, it's great. But then when he's contributing to your open source project, that's so exciting. So I'm super happy about it. He has a great program. Okay. So anyway, when I was explaining to this, he said, if you don't tell me where range, act, and assert is, I'm lost. Okay, so first we get the kernel ready. Then we do an act, which is to submit to the kernel. And then we do a check, which is, do we have any errors? So now if I run this, it's going to pass. I want to run it. I want you to know it passed. If I can get it to up here, it will pass. And I'm going to actually step through the next one. I'm not going to step through this one. This is, will it compile? Does it work? Okay. So any questions yet? When will it be usable in VS Code? When will what be usable in VS Code? I need to get a little more clarification on that question. The work I'm doing right here, I think, could all be done in VS Code. And VS Code already supports .NET Interactive and actually has a really good experience for that. Okay, so the other test is a little bit more interesting, because the kernel needs two submissions. First, we need to tell the kernel about what we're running, and then we need to run it. So the first one is actually now part of the arrange. So we're going to check, and we are going to make sure we don't have errors, because there's no sense in continuing, and our ability to debug the test would then be extremely confusing. So here I am going to debug this, except I have my previous test still running. What's going on? Why can't I run? This is bad. If anyone sees my problem, they should tell me. I am so confused. I seem to be running, except I'm not. And I definitely have something going on here. I don't want to restart Visual Studio. I really don't. I really don't. Okay, now can we do it? Apparently, I can't do this. Oh my gosh. Does anyone see a reason that I would still be, oh, now I can build. Let's see if that helps. Build. I'm so confused. Okay. It's going to be so much more clear if I can actually set these breakpoints. And so the code that I've got in here, well, actually, I'll write it out once I get a hold of it. Once we have the generated source put together. But I told you that the way I've got this written was a fragment. And the fragment gets wrapped in a method and wrapped in a class. And one of the tricks is that when you're in .NET Interactive, you can't use a namespace. So normally it would be wrap in method, wrap in class, wrap in namespace, and preface with using. And here I have to do wrap in method class, but not namespace, and preface with using. So now, please tell me I can now run this test. All right, so why don't we talk while I restart Visual Studio, which is extremely annoying, but is probably the best thing to do right now. And I'll close the source generators as well, because I don't know exactly what's going on. Preview. I was in this preview because I thought it would be the stable one. So let's see how this goes. Any questions while this is starting back up? It's Visual Studio, so as you know, it will take just a minute. Sing a song? Immo, you've just seen a lot of this for the first time. So why don't you tell me how exploded your head is right now?
Well, I was mostly reading questions, so people are
Okay,
having fun with your issues with the Test Explorer. So it makes sense to me. I think one of the questions that kind of popped up in chat, and I kind of had the same problem as well, and I talked with Phillip about this at some point too, is that if you develop source generators, you kind of want to consume them immediately in a project. And today that's kind of finicky because of the way VS works and the source generators are evaluated, right? So that you basically have to restart VS when you rebuild your source generator because changes are not being picked up, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the general problem with source generators is because they're kind of meta. So it's hard to provide a fully fluent experience with those. But I think it's fair to say that we try to improve the experience in these areas.
Well, I mean, so the other thing to keep in mind is just because source generators are going to see their first release in, .NET 5, C# 9 doesn't mean that that's sort of the be all end all. We're well aware that it's not just a compiler feature, it's also tooling that needs to work with that compiler feature. And the first release of this is making sure that we get the compiler feature right, because that includes APIs. And once we release a set of APIs, they can't change anymore. And so that's where the team's focus has been on. To be clear, there's also been plenty of focus on the tooling side of stuff. Like the tooling is a lot better than it was when the very first preview of this stuff came out. But this is definitely an example of the sort of thing that we're going to keep looking at as we continue to evolve the entire experience around source generators, especially once the compiler layer of it is stable.
And it's also like when we talked about generators like a year ago or 2 years ago on Twitter, right? Basically, the number one thing the entire team said is that we are very concerned about the VS experience because it's hard to do that. And then virtually everybody said, I don't care, just give me the feature, right? And so like what we're doing right now is basically doing that, right? We're trying to scope the feature set in something where we can provide tooling for, but it is non-trivial, but we also feel like source generators are so useful that let's give it a shot and see where it actually falls over, right? And I feel like that is an area where you should give us feedback on. It's not going to be a feature that will be made in the sense that everybody will use them every time, right, or all the time. But it is certainly a feature that, when used right, is super powerful and very interesting.
Yeah. And the feature, the things that did get focus were the things that are most critical, which is, can you see the code that gets generated behind what's going on? And that was considered an absolutely must-have for .NET 5. You might have noticed that the formatting was pretty yucky and some of the code that I jumped into, and that's because that's something that's considered. We can do that later. We can make the formatting good later. Ideally, the generated code would pop up with your editor config formatting applied. I don't know if that's what they have in mind, but it would be a pretty good experience. And I'm not sure whether this is going to go well or not, because I'm not seeing the right kind of dot there, but it seems to still be trying. So let's see if I'm going to show up on in that or not. I am really disappointed if I can't get this to work, because it was working, and I don't know what has gone south on this. Oh, yes. Can we clap? We're debugging. Let's clap. Yay, thank you all for your patience to get here. I don't know quite what got us this far, but this is what I want to show you. And then we'll look at any questions. So I'm setting some variables, some stuff. This isn't very interesting. I have some test data that contains just gives me some source to start with. And remember, each of those steps I'm testing separately. So I'm not going back to creating the syntax tree, creating the intermediate structure, creating the source code. I don't want to do that. I want to create a fake intermediate structure, which is in test data. And in this case, I actually want to go further. I want to create fake strings. So I'm not also testing the step between the interim structure and the string. So I have a string ready to go. And that string looks like this and I'm not getting that popping up as but I'll show you in just a second. So this is really small to see, but it's just var command equals new command and then return command. It's just super short. It's just what that method would be. And then we'll go to this. And unfortunately, my immediate window may be too small to see, but I will try. I'll say the generated source. Go. Good. Okay, so I'm sorry for all the /n's in there, but it's using system command line, public class, my class, public command, get command. So it's a public method returning a command, and then it's var command equals new command. So it's just a simple thing. But command is a class in system command line, and I'm creating an instance of that. So the next thing I want to do is make sure that that code is good, because everything else fails if it is not good. So I'm going to submit it to the kernel. And the kernel does not normally take quite this long, but hopefully everything's going to stay together. Come on, don't let me down. My machine is definitely on shaky ground right now. So if I just disappear in a puff of smoke, that's what's happened, in Immo, and Phillip will finish up, because my machine is definitely. So at this point, yes, I compiled that code just fine. And now, so it's in the kernel. So that's a class called my class with a method called my, whatever I called it, get command. The class called get command, and that is sitting inside the kernel waiting to be called. So I need to do a second submission, which is going to be, what am I going to do? Oh, I'm just going to create a new one. And now this is a little different. The first one was, let me give you a bunch of code and you're going to hold it. It didn't do anything. This one says, oh, I'm giving you an expression. You're going to give me something back. So the expression I'm giving is new class name method that was previously defined, normal string literals. And so then I'm going to run that, and I'm going to make sure I don't have any error. And again, oh, that was fast. All right. So now I'm going to make sure I have no errors. I have no errors. And now the result with instance is a result. I'm going to then get the value out of that. Okay. So now foo is to the return value, which is at this point, I don't think it's typed. I didn't think it was typed when I did this, because then I went ahead and did the cast right there. And now the command has a property called name, and it should be my class. Now you'll notice this is not exactly what we started with. And that difference is because my code, the work I'm doing includes changing from a C# friendly name of my class to a kebab case expected in POSIX. And so that's part of what happens going into that interim structure. And our test passes, yay, okay? So that was a lot of stuff, but I can absolutely say that complex generators can be written in a way that are unit testable. I'm quite confident we've gotten to that. And I'm pleased to have other people may have a different approach. I'm not going to suggest this is the only approach to doing unit testing for source generators, but this is an approach. And so I feel really good about that. So Immo and Phillip are laughing. I'm afraid to know why. All right.
That was a clap not only for the awesome demo, but also for your machine that managed to not completely die in the process of streaming something and downloading all the video stuff and also compiling and running source generators. That's good job, Kathleen's machine as well.
Yeah, and I live in a small apartment, and so I don't have, nor do I want, a big machine sitting under my desk because my desk is 3 feet wide. So all of this is on a Surface Pro. I just have to say that it's all on a Surface, just a little tiny 1.5 pound machine. So yeah. All right, so the Test Explorer issue on camera, I'm gonna have to follow up on that if you want to make sure we know which one you're talking about. Test Explorer is evolving. It is getting better. We keep making it better, but it still has a ways to go. So I don't know which problem you picked up on the screen there. And thanks for coming from Vietnam. That's great.
Awesome.
All right.
So then this is it for today.
Something else to close up. That was a lot. I mean, I just threw so much at you in an hour. It's not normally what we do in this. If this is the first time you come, this is normally we are a lot lighter and I'll joke a lot more and we do a lot more like what's going on. And this time, because I had this, I thought it was really worth getting it out there to share with people.
Yeah, and if people have ideas what they want us to cover next time, now is your time. Post it in chat.
Yeah. And if you like this kind of deep dive into something, as opposed to when we just like talk about a lot of different things and go, 5 to 10 minutes into 4 or 5 topics. If you want to let us know which way you like this to go, our overall idea here is so you know what's going on with team. That's what, and we're lots of people on the team. So yeah.
Awesome. Then I think unless there are more questions popping up. For star. I'm not sure what star is. The use cases for source generator. What I'm doing here is I can show you super quick. Is right here. Is rather than you having to know anything about system command line, I want you to be able to write a class that looks something like this, probably with some attributes. Something like, there's a alias, it's actually alias -s, something like that. Okay, there's probably gonna be a little bit more, but you just have to write a class like this, and then the rest of it gets done for you. That is one kind of more complex goal that we can do with search generators. So I think the question was more about, because I think his link got censored, so he didn't mean ****. I think he meant ASP.NET.
Oh, well, there's a lot of teams inside of Microsoft right now that are looking at this feature, just like there's a lot of people outside Microsoft thinking about this feature. And there are definitely places that reflection is being used today that people are looking at whether or not it's the right thing to use going forward. So exactly what you have in mind and exactly whether that's a good use of it would require knowing things I don't know, including whether there is a Roslyn compilation step that is in play. So if you're looking at something that's strictly runtime, this isn't going to help you because you have no Roslyn compiler. So yeah.
So one thing we are looking at from my team, right? I work on the base sales libraries team, so we build the fundamentals like networking and collections and reflection, all of that. So we are trying to figure out what we can do in the framework all up to make it more linker friendly, because we now have a linker that allows trimming and basically producing single files where everything gets merged in. And the fundamental issue with reflection is that it's not linker friendly, right? Because we can't see what you're actually trying to do at runtime. And so when we link stuff out that you then reflection invoke later, well, then bad things will happen. And so one area where reflection invoke is used a lot is in basically all of ASP.NET, right? If you think about how controllers find views or actions or whatever the terminology is, I forget ASP.NET, but it's all based on conventions and naming conventions and classes, right? Similar with serialization, right? Every time you invoke a web API or return data from web API, serialization happens, right? And so one area where we concretely look at source generators is JSON serialization, where if you reference the JSON serializer, the idea is we give you a bunch of attributes that you can put on types. And when you do that, then you don't have to do nothing. Basically, you just compile your project, and then we are injecting a source generator into your project that generates the serialization code so that it doesn't go via reflection, right? And then that hopefully speeds up the serialization, deserialization, but it also means that when we are linking this whole thing, we know what actually is needed, right? And so that's a very effective way to do source generation in a way where the framework does it for you. You're just a user for it. You don't have to think about it. And that's kind of the goal with source generators in general, that we try to get framework authors, library authors to find creative uses for those. And so that when you're consuming a NuGet package that happens to use a source generator, it's not something that you have to think about. It just means, code gets generated at compile time rather than at runtime.
Yeah, I think the linker is a super important thing to point out. And also when we're looking at some of the experiences around this, just to let people know, we're ahead of where we thought we would be with adoption on source generators by like maybe a year, where we're seeing a lot more interest of people doing a lot more broad things. It was sort of a, hey, there's some people that have some ideas. We'll see what they're going to do with it. And there's a lot of people with a lot of ideas doing a lot of different things. So it's definitely going well, but it also means that we're playing catch up with the community on that, especially in the Visual Studio aspects of it. Like I didn't know, and there may be a way to do it, but I didn't know how to jump into that other half of that class, jump from one partial to another when the other partial is sitting out in temporary space.
So I have to drop off because I have a meeting at 11.
All right. Okay. And so Swagger is one. That's the team that's looking at it. Just answer a couple more questions before we drop off. Is it possible to use source generators without Visual Studio and have a good dev experience? I don't know what the jumping around experience is going to be in VS Code or something else. So I want to just narrow down what I'm saying here. So all of the, all the code I showed runs in anything. And, there's a ton of things that you're going to be able to do across different environments. This is a compiler feature, so it will run. The problem is that you really want to be able to jump to that code. And I cannot tell you what that experience is going to be in VS Code, unless Immo knows. Are you ahead of me on this one? Do you know what happens if you're not in Visual Studio Code?
So I used source generators already for my own project, which, my compiler stream. So I basically use the generator as part of my compiler to generate some stuff.
Right.
The experience right now in VS Code is pretty rough because OmniSharp isn't aware of source generators. So creative hackery to effectively generate the file into the same directory where the project is, so you can at least see it. And that to work. It was a bug, but it did work relatively well. I talked to Phillip about it, and basically it's just a matter of, I guess, time until OmniSharp is aware of that. And then I would assume that the same experience you see in VS, where you have 12 on things, will just work because the file is generated to disk in the OBJ folder somewhere, right? And then in workspace, you'll be able to resolve it and find it, right? That's, I think, the idea. But I mean, there will be issues, right? Which is when you actually have the generator itself in source code form, part of the same solution, then it is tricky because every time you recompile the source generator, now you basically have to recompile the rest. And so that's where the experience is spotty today, right? If you actually have a pre-generated generator that is referenced as a NuGet package, then it's easier because then every time you edit your code, the generator doesn't have to get recompiled every time, right? And then that makes it a lot easier. But I think we need to make the experience better because from my eyes, I would say There are certainly cases where the generator is general purpose and is shipped as a NuGet package. But in many ways, you want the generator to be part of your project because it's very specific to your project. It's like, well, I have this XML file, or I have this one CSV file, and I want to generate code in a very specific way. And I don't want to ship this to the world because, well, it's really only applicable to this one project, right? And I feel like that's where the experience today is rough. But I don't think that's a VS versus VS problem. That's more a conceptual problem of how do we make this efficient and how do we allow users to reason about the experience. But
yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons. One of which is I would suggest people move away from, which is if you're doing development, don't be trying to do it outside of the source generator experience and then drop it in when you know it's solid. Okay, but then what you're talking about, which is a very specific experience, one way that would be a pretty smooth path today is for you to use a different NuGet feed that points to a local directory. And then even if it's in your solution, it's not going to use a project reference. It's just going to bounce out to the DLL if you have that as a feed. So that's one way that you could do it today. But in Visual Studio, I'm pretty sure you have to restart if you change an analyzer or a loading an analyzer. If you change it, I think if it's new, that's not a problem. But when you have one and it's loaded, I don't think it's very smart about saying, toss this one away and get the new copy of it. So I think there's some issues there that will smooth out where source generators needs different things than the analyzers do.
Yeah, think about how the experience is. I think if you once you edit the generator, you have to restart VS because once it's compiled and loaded, it's immutable for the session of VS. So this is why interactive development of the generator sucks today. But once you have the generator, and if it's in your solution and doesn't change, and the only thing that changes is generated code, that experience works already very well. And that's where VS Code needs to do some catch-up work. But I think the experience of you interactively editing the generator, that's the hard part. And maybe there's some gesture where you can say right-click, invalidate or something, right? Or maybe it's automatic, but we'll see.
I'm insisting on staying away from that. I'm going to have full confidence when I drop the generator in, and I'm excited about that. But it's so I think that right now today, what Immo's saying is, if you're going to write a generator, I definitely would go to the fully deeply unit tested first. So when you drop it in, and remember your input eventually, whatever many steps you have, one or more, your input needs to be what's going to be the input to that source generator, which is going to be, you can look at one of the generators and see how you get a semantic model. And it's going to be the context, which has the ability to make the semantic model from the syntax tree. So that's what you're going to get. So you're going to get what you need. And then if you're going to do a receiver, a syntax receiver, getting your candidates in there and have that be however your tests work, that you have a step that takes those so that when you drop it in, it should work fine. And I would then run through your pipeline and then drop the small, easy one in before you spend a whole lot of time working on it. So, Well, are we close to the end of time?
I think we should finish now.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us today.
Exactly. So then bye-bye. And I see all of you, or we see all of you in, I think, 4 weeks from now.
3 or 4 weeks, whenever we come back. Yeah.
I think they ship, so I'm not sure that's actually happening in that week, but we'll see.
Well, if it's right in the middle of when we're shipping, then we might be in the middle of a conference. We have a conference coming up. So, yeah.
Exactly.
All right.
So, see you later. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.